doubt whether speaking English or in Italian, perhaps it's better if I speak.
Well, thanks very much, and good to see you all here. Okay, so I'm assuming that most of you understand or at least have a working knowledge of the principles we've developed under the name modern monetary theory. And what I've been working on recently with Louisa Connors, we've been working on this concept of framing modern monetary theory. And so I thought it would be interesting, rather than just rehearse the principles of MMT, to give you an idea of what we're thinking now about how to take those principles and push them into the public policy debate. Macroeconomic points, debates are everywhere now. Every night on the TV and the radio, we hear discussion of macroeconomics. And the problem is twofold. First, the principles of macroeconomics aren't that easy. They're relatively opaque. What is an interest rate? What is a price level? It's not what you pay for something in a shop. It's an ambiguous, virtual concept, a price level. And the second problem is that the way in which the debate is presented of these difficult concepts exacerbates that difficulty of comprehension. And overlaying that are what we call these ideological agendas. So the debate isn't about pure knowledge, if only it was. There's an ideological element overlaying these very difficult concepts, which are then dispersed in the world through a social media now and a financial press that hasn't got a clue. So this point here is that what we argue now is that what we refer to as the neoliberal agenda, mainstream economics, the sort you learn in this university.
Not so much here.
The sort you learn in most universities is not supported by any evidence base, because in terms of its application and its evidence veracity, it fails badly. It gets it wrong every time. It's a poor descriptor of the real world. And the global financial crisis tells us that mainstream macroeconomics has really failed. Its success comes down to the way it frames itself, that is, presents itself, and the language that it uses to present itself. And so what this talk is about, and what my current research is with Louisa Connors is about, is working out how framing and language, because Louisa's a linguistic person and I'm an economist, we're working together to work out how language is used and misused to support ideological agendas which have no empirical validity. And finally, how we can frame modern monetary theory so that it appeals to the way people receive information in the public debate. So quickly, the idea is that language constrains the way we think. And we think in terms of what linguists call key metaphors. And metaphors are the way in which we relate knowledge to our experience. And what we argue is that neoliberal thinking uses metaphors in a particular way, and they've worked out very successfully how to exploit the way in which we receive knowledge to advance their ideological agenda. Okay, so to organise your thinking, here are two very contrasting visions of the economy. The first vision on the left here has the economy as an entity that's separate from us, and it's separate from the natural environment. And that, this is the diagram again on the left, and that it's seen as being the economy is seen as being a natural construct. It's a self-governing natural construct. And unfortunately, it gets sick. And it gets sick if we allow governments to interfere with its natural processes. It gets sick if we force it to pay minimum wages or provide income support. And our role in this vision is to work hard. It's a religious concept. We've got to have faith in the economy, we've got to work hard, and we've got to make sacrifices. So, you know, Italy should know all about a statements that tell us to sacrifice and be good. And anybody who falls by the wayside, the poor, the unemployed, those with disabilities, they're conceived as being miscreants. Something wrong with them. They've got something wrong with them, that they haven't been able to work hard enough or sacrifice hard as much. And the successful people are seen as being, you know, the pillars of virtue. And this is the neoliberal vision of the economy. So in this vision, we in nature serve the economy. We're its servants, and we've got to be good and be obedient. And the framing of this is what makes neoliberalism so successful and pervasive. And we'll come back to that in a second. The alternative vision, which I believe people who understand MMT should make central in their political efforts. Remember that MMT isn't a political movement. It's just a set of tools. It's an organising framework to understand the way in which policy interventions in private sector behaviour will elicit reactions. MMT isn't an end in itself. MMT can be used by the right-wing extreme and the left-wing extreme and those in between to advance whatever value systems and purposes they desire. And so any political movement that wants to aspire to advance MMT thinking shouldn't be talking about MMT. It should be talking about a vision for the economy and how that economy can serve people. So this is what I would call a progressive vision of the economy, which I think MMT supporters should be advancing. And what we see here is something quite different if you juxtapose that with the previous diagram. Here we've got the economy down here, and its only purpose is to serve us, and we're embedded within the planet. And so we want to make sure the planet survives, because we're in it, and we want to make sure the economy serves us within the constraint that we want the planet to survive. And so, in this vision, the economy isn't something separate from us. We create it. We construct it and we control it. And there's nothing natural about it at all. There's no natural systems at all. They're all controlled by us. And in this situation, in this vision, the government at each level is our agent. It's a tool that we can use when we can't do something ourselves. And it's not there to be a moral arbiter about whether we're working hard enough or wanting too higher wages. It's there to advance public purpose and to make sure that we live as harmoniously within that planet, and we make this thing called the economy work for us. And so the question one point. So the question we MMTers on the progressive side should be asking is, what's the purpose we seek to achieve? MMT isn't an end. The end is the purposes that we want economic policy, we want to get that economy achieving for us so that we're living harmoniously with the planet. And that's a totally different vision, and it needs to be framed and presented in a different way with different language to the previous vision. Okay, what this slide tells us is that if you... So often I used to wonder, why the hell do people not get this? And the answer lies in the fact that if we talk to social psychologists and cognitive linguists and cognitive philosophers who understand all these things, what they tell you is that the way in which our minds work is that we're inherently embodied. And what that means is that we relate to things in a metaphorical way. Now, I haven't got time today to go into deep sort of discussion about this, but often this point here, that mostly our thinking is unconscious, and we have the capacity to even hold views that are internally inconsistent. And we have the capacity to hold views that are actually detrimental to our own well-being without even knowing that we're holding the views that are detrimental. In the way in which we construct metaphors and link metaphors, and I'll show you some examples. And fortunately, we have the capacity to construe, that is, think about the same information in a multitude of different ways. So it's counterintuitive to the way we think. So our language acquisition when we're young will construct a metaphor that a deficit is bad because it means a shortfall. It means we're without something, and up is better than down. These are metaphors. We think in terms of these ups and downs and goods and bads and big and small. And so as soon as you hear the word deficit, we're trained in our early language to say bad, not good, because we haven't been taught to link, say, a fiscal deficit with higher employment. Higher is good, but we haven't made the causal link. And the neoliberals exploit that. They've understood this better than the left, for sure. And so they understand that if they keep pushing out in the media statements about the deficit and debt, debt's another one. You're in debt, you owe something, that's bad. And so they can exploit through very carefully marketed language and very simple framed metaphors, they can get away with blue murder. Just quickly, here are some examples from the English press, and I'm sure they're the same in Italian press. So government spending, what do we hear all the time? Living beyond our means. That's the metaphor is living beyond your means. The intent of the metaphor is to generate a feeling that we're excessive, that we need to sacrifice to bring things back into sustainability. Another example is nation has maxed out its credit card. That's often used in the English financial press. It's the intent of that metaphor is that we've run out of money. And note that these metaphors also personalise a government behaviour into our own experience. So they want us to think the government is really like us as an individual family or household. And of course we get the credit card statement each month and we go, bloody hell, what have we done with overspending? And we relate that experience to the government when we're being hit with these metaphors in the press and by politicians and think tanks. Oh, we've run out of money, it's irresponsible, we've got to cut back. And another one is the deteriorating state of the budget. Well, the analogy is a health analogy. It's not well, it's sick. And not well and sick is bad. We don't want to be sick. When we've got a sick in bed, we feel awful. And so they build those metaphors into the way we understand things from the very early age, into good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable. Public debt, the debt mountain, we hear that all the time in the press. Well, a mountain's something big. It's not a hill, it's not a flat surface, it's big and it's hard to walk up and you can fall off it. These are, that's a metaphor, the mountain. Well, what does debt mountain mean, for God's sake? It's not a mountain, but it's a metaphorical use of language that invokes an emotional state that allows us to accept something as propositions that are absolutely stupid, that are illogical and wrong in fact. We accept them as being truth, and therefore we behave accordingly. And one of the problems that we face is that the progressive side of politics use these metaphors too. And they attempt to differentiate themselves from the conservative side of politics by saying things like, well, we'll cut the deficit, but more slowly. And we'll be fairer about it. We'll tax the rich. But we're still going to cut the deficit. Why? Because the deficit is deteriorating, it's sick. Or it's a black hole, which is like a star blowing up. And that's one of the really big problems that the left in world politics in every country that I'm aware of has bought in to this neoliberal metaphorical language and just thinks that they're going to be fairer about it. Well, that's just bullshit. So here are some misconceptions that these metaphors support. The government faces the same budget constraint as a household. Well, no, it doesn't. Not the Italian government does. Eurozone governments do, but a fiat currency issuing government doesn't. Any attempt to bring back the experience of a national currency issuing government to our own experience will lead to wrong conclusions. Here's another example. The metaphors lead us to conclude that budget surpluses are good and fiscal deficits are bad. And if the fiscal deficit was rising, that's even worse than if it's lower. And the context in which the fiscal balance is published is ignored. And what MMT teaches us is that there's no good or bad about a particular fiscal position at all. It's a meaningless comparison of language and concept. Sometimes a fiscal surplus will be appropriate. Other times a fiscal deficit will be appropriate. Sometimes a 2% of GDP fiscal deficit will be appropriate. Sometimes in different circumstances a 10% deficit of GDP will be appropriate. And so it all depends the situation. And this brings us back to the vision of the economy. It depends upon what your policy aim is. If in advancing your social and goals of advancing prosperity for all, you need a deficit of 10% of GDP, well then that's a successful outcome. But it might be that the same goals can be achieved depending upon the behaviour of the other sectors, the external sector and the private domestic sector, with a surplus. It's not context independent. And so a narrow focus on financial ratios all the time without promoting the context in which those financial ratios have occurred is a mindless thing. And so the progressive agenda should be promoting what are the visions for the government it's not to achieve a particular fiscal outcome, it's to achieve this employment, this climate change objective, this reduction in inequality. These are the goals of government, and we should be emphasising those and de-emphasising what the fiscal balance is. It's irrelevant if we're achieving our objectives. So once you start understanding the way in which we think and the way in which metaphors are put together by us and language supporting that, then you've got a starting point for a progressive agenda. And that's the sort of work I'm doing now. We're developing with Louise O'Connor, I'm developing with Louise O'Connor as a language of MMT, a language of a progressive agenda. And the argument can never really start with facts. So we can't have an argument with neoliberals about you're wrong and I'm right. That's not going to get anywhere, because we're not tapping in to the way in which we perceive. I'm sorry. So SMS from somewhere. Oh, I see. We're not tapping into this metaphorical way. We don't think in terms of facts. As I said before, we can see facts in all sorts of different ways, and we also can see things in internally inconsistent ways. So we can never start with you're wrong and I'm right. That's not going to get us anywhere. What we've got to do is to start developing different language and a different set of metaphors, and to promote ideas that people can relate to in a metaphorical way. So things like social purpose and aspiration should be the starting point of your discussion with people. So you shouldn't go to a bar and say, let's have a talk about MMT, isn't neoliberal economics wrong? Just soak another drink and that'll be the end of the discussion. What you've got to go in there and start talking about is, what do we want from society? What are the big issues? What matters to you? And so this should be, our social purpose should be articulated and narrated in the public debate in ways which will resonate and activate the frames in which we can accept these metaphorical frames that we've learned from young to associate arguments with and work and to react in whether we like it or not, whether we think it's good or bad. That's the challenge initially. Not to say the government should have a bigger deficit. We've got to first of all start with what do we want to achieve, and then it becomes self-evident that the fiscal deficit has to be larger. So here's an example of broad purpose. In New Zealand there's a group of local government mayors who want to have a full employment. And the way they sell their message is they have a metaphor that they use: zero waste of New Zealanders. Zero, we know what we have a quantification of that waste. We're relating it to waste to people, so there's a metaphorical link to people here, and we know that zero waste is a good thing. We intrinsically feel that. And of course that establishes a very solid statement of purpose for their activities. Now but that's a motherhood statement. What does it mean? And here's another motherhood statement: free markets will grow the economy and create jobs. How many conservative politicians and progressive economy politicians say that? Almost everybody. But what does it mean? Well, we don't ever get beyond that. We just metaphorically think freedom is good as opposed to oppression. That triggers a set of metaphors. Jobs is good. Linking those things must be right. And we're not encouraged then to go further than that. And of course what we know is that the way we think and understand language in this metaphorical way is through event causation structures. So there's an event, something happens, like a free market, and then there's a outcome, plenty of jobs. And what the neoliberals do is create a causation structure in our minds by just repeating this statement all the time. In the press, on the media, every time a politician gets up, they'll say this. And we're not encouraged to go further than that, but we then have this causal link between the event and the outcome. And the task of the progressives is to alter the event causation with a new set of metaphors. So what a progressive narrative has to do is to build a sequence of language and metaphors and thinking that start with a purpose, a goal, like we want jobs for everybody, that's the purpose. But we've got to then add another step, an appropriate action to build the event causality so that people will accept the goal and what's needed to make the goal. So you have a purpose and a manifestation of that purpose as an end, and jobs for all. But then the action that we have to develop an understanding of is that, well, that means we have to have aggregate spending or aggregate demand rising by X% to generate Y million jobs. We need to explain that message because the Conservatives are busy out there telling you that you can have cuts in government spending and then we'll have growth. And people believe it. So the action has to be, you need to have this spending and explain why. And then, of course, who's responsible for that triggering the causation? Well, if the private sector's not spending, it has to be the government. I was at a round table in Florence yesterday, and a German economist got up there and he was saying about, there's high savings in Germany and the Netherlands and Switzerland, and the government can't do anything to alter people's behaviour in those countries, therefore we can't do much about it. Well, the elephant in the room that he didn't talk about was that if the non-government sector's saving a lot, there's another sector that can spend to fill the gap. So the challenge is twofold. First of all, is to understand basic MMT principles. But that's pretty trivial. It's not rocket science. But the second challenge is to develop a language and a framing procedure that appeals to our metaphorical instincts. And here's some examples. So here's the first sentence says, government spent X million dollars. That's the news headline. We immediately say gone, spent in English means to be spent, to be exhausted. If you're an athlete and you've run too hard, you finish spent. That's bad. And waste is, it's spent. It's just, where's it gone? It's just the alternative way of framing the same thing is the government invested X million dollars to enhance something we like. Public education, better transport, climate change initiatives, better health systems, things that we really care about but don't quite understand what's going on about them. So the language difference is just spent and investment, and also the spending has gone somewhere, and where it's gone is something we articulate as good. So this is what's called in linguistics the more is up metaphor. We think metaphorically that if we've got more of something, then it's up and it's good. And so if we say invest rather than spent, spent means down, that's bad, invest means up, that's good. It's just a simple use of language that changes the way in which we frame. It's the same metaphors, same way we metaphorically think, but it's a different way of, different language that triggers that metaphor to have a different conclusion and emotion altogether. And then another one is, well, I'll let you. So here's another way in which metaphors work. This more is up, meaning if we've got more, we're happy, also works in reverse, as I said. So if we've got a statement, the government budget deficit, underlying budget deficit is X% of GDP, that invokes metaphorically something that's bad. First of all, the use of the word budget invokes the household analogy, because we talk about our household budget. And also the deficit is in language is bad. It's a shortfall. And so we can avoid the reverse impact of the more is up metaphor in the way we think by linking it to what's called an appropriate event structure. And so this links two metaphors. More is up is one identified metaphor in human behaviour and thinking, and the other one are purposes or destinations. This is another basic metaphor. So purposes are somewhere we want to go to, a destination. And so we might want to, and the destination must always be prominent in the language you use. So we can take that previous statement and build a different metaphorical links, exploiting different metaphors to get something that's good out of a statement that has the same factual content, but it's totally different response, public, individual response. Here's the statement: the government deficit, I've dropped budget there, and you won't hear me use in the public, in my writing, I don't use the word budget, I always say fiscal balance or fiscal study. And so the government deficit, I've immediately got rid of the concept of invoking a household metaphor and that a household experience. And so the statement is, it rose, it went up, and if I left it at that, that would leave something that's bad, because a deficit's a shortfall, and if you're getting a bigger shortfall, not good. But then I'm linking it to a destination that's a purpose. And so I'm saying, and generated is a causal word, that if I didn't have that rising deficit, I wouldn't have the destination. I've caused a destination through this event structure. And these are all exploiting these metaphorical ways of thinking. So I've generated what? A destination. High levels of wealth for households and firms. And so I'm immediately building MMT understanding to make deficits a good thing, invoking a sense that deficits are good things because they're generating and taking us to somewhere we want to go. Rather than just say it rose, I'm telling it rose because we had to get somewhere, and where we had to go is where we want to be. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there and make one last statement and linking it to what I said. If you want to, so that this work is aiming to take basic MMT principles into just core ways in which humans respond to their environment. By understanding language better, understanding the way we say things, and we want to reinforce that second vision of the economy. And so we've got to be very careful in every statement and every word we use so that we do appeal to the way we think metaphorically. We want to exploit that and frame the debate so we get what we want. Now, what that means is that the politicisation So I'm really happy that there are MMT groups in Italy. That's the first point. That's a great thing, that you're coming together to understand these ideas and to try to develop them. I'm unhappy that I've now learned that there's two of them, and they used to be one, and they've splintered off for whatever reason. I learned from one group in Florence and another group today. That's madness. The left always splinter. Someone gets pissed off with somebody else, somebody doesn't like somebody else, and so they forget that their troubles are down here, the greater cause is up here. Forget it. Get over it. And unite, because you're already a minority. It's no point having splinter groups with factions and animosities. That's the first point I make. Have a meeting and come back together. The second point I'd make is that MMT is just a set of tools and it's a framework. It's just a way of understanding behaviour and outcomes in relation to inputs. It's not an end in itself. It can't form the basis of a political movement. And when I see and you'll excuse me for saying this, I hope, when I see something like a Moseley MMT group, now Warren's one of my best friends, known him for a very long time, but I see that as giving the image, exploiting metaphors and language, as looking like a cult. Looking like a cult. That somehow this Moseley MMT group, well, what does that mean? It's not a basis, in my view, for political mobilisation. The basis for political motivation, my group is called the Centre of Full Employment and Equity. Public purpose, square centre, it doesn't mention MMT. When I'm on the meeting, I never say MMT. Ever. Because it's a cult. It appeals to people as some sort of little faction. And the metaphorical association becomes, oh, you're like the Jonestown mob who went to the northern, South America, had the Kool-Aid. And so what I'd say is that if you're wanting to, when you come together, all your groups back together again, be nice to each other, restructure your public image in terms of a progressive public purpose rather than MMT, which is just a toolbox. And what I learned in Florence was that the left, and it's a separate debate, the left in Italy don't want to know about the debate about exiting the euro because they think the right wing's captured that agenda. Well, that just shows to me lack of leadership on the left, that they can't differentiate themselves from a pack of fascists. So I'd urge you to reconstruct yourselves in a political way. You've done great to develop these networks and just pushing the agenda. But the agenda's not enough. You've got to have language and you've got to exploit the metaphors with these grand statements, those grand visions of what the public purpose is. That's what I'd urge you to do. Get out of what we would see in the Western world as a cult and become a grand progressive vision. Excuse me for saying that.